Welcome to the Deep Dive. You ready to tackle some macroeconomics with me today?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Awesome. We're diving deep into the forces that shape, well, entire economies this time. Got a whole stack of research here, kind of like Economics 101, but we're going for those aha moments, not just textbook definitions,
Yeah, it's like zooming out from individual markets, right? Seeing the whole economic forest, the big picture.
Exactly. And, I always thought economics was all about, money. But this material really frames it around production and consumption more, right? Is that fair?
Absolutely. Money is just a tool, really. Macroeconomics is about what a nation produces, how that production changes over time, and, ultimately how it all impacts living standards.
Okay, so speaking of production, figure 30 here. It shows the growth of the U.S. economy since 1900, and it is, it's mind-boggling. Real GDP, almost 40 times larger.
Yeah.
Even with, Great Depression, wars, the trend just keeps going up.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is it's not just population growth. Figure 31 actually shows that output per person has also gone way up, meaning, the average American today, much higher standard of living than a century ago.
That's incredible. But then figure 32, it shows this prosperity. It's not universal, right? Huge disparities in output per person across different countries. China, for example, a massive population, but their total GDP is still only 2/3 of the U.S.
Right, and those differences in output, they mean very different living standards. Figure 33 highlights the link between higher output per person and things like longer life expectancy, better education, even a cleaner environment.
What makes you think about what drives those differences? Is it all about technology, or is there more to it?
Well, technology definitely plays a huge role, but it's not the whole story. We also need to consider things like, education levels, access to capital, the quality of institutions.
Okay, so bigger picture stuff too. That makes sense. Now we've seen this long-term growth trend, but what about those shorter-term ups and downs? The booms and busts, figure 34, it shows that roller coaster, the business cycle, right? With those periods of expansion and contraction.
Yeah, and understanding those cycles is key for policymakers because, those downturns, recessions, they have real consequences. People lose jobs, businesses suffer, it impacts everyone.
And speaking of jobs, figure 35 shows the unemployment rate swinging wildly over the last century, spiking during the Great Depression and more recently with the pandemic.
It's interesting, though, how even in good times, unemployment never hits zero. There's always some level of, churn as people enter the workforce, leave for new opportunities.
Right, and figure 41, it even breaks down the labor force back in July 2020, showing how different groups were impacted by the pandemic. Really underscores the human cost of those economic swings.
Absolutely. Now, beyond unemployment, another big concern for economists, and really all of us, is inflation. Figure 36 shows just how much prices have fluctuated over time.
Yeah, it's a wild ride, isn't it? Even a period of deflation during the Great Depression. But generally, prices keep going up. So doesn't that mean, we're all getting poorer over time?
Exactly. Inflation erodes our purchasing power, makes it harder to afford the things we need. Controlling inflation, that's a major goal of macroeconomic policy.
Okay, so we've got economic growth, we've got unemployment, we've got inflation. It seems like global trade plays a role in all of this too, right? Figure 37 shows the trend of U.S. exports and imports.
Right. Notice that shift from a trade surplus to a trade deficit, since the 1970s. We're importing more than we export now, which has implications for both growth and employment.
Interesting. Okay, so we've touched on these key indicators, but it's clear that measuring something as complex as a national economy can't be simple, right? How do we even start to quantify that?
Well, that's where GDP comes in, gross domestic product. It's the main tool we use to measure, the overall output of an economy. Might seem daunting, but it's actually pretty logical.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. How do you add up something as diverse as, say, healthcare services and manufacturing output?
So GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period. Let's unpack that a little. We use market value because it reflects what people are willing to pay for things.
So a high-end car, it contributes more to GDP than a loaf of bread.
Precisely. Now, the final goods and services part, that's important too. We're only counting the end product to avoid double counting. Think of that part. We're not adding the value of the steel, the tires, the engine separately. That's already factored into the car's final price.
Okay, so we're measuring the value added at each stage, culminating in that final product.
Yeah.
Makes sense. What about goods produced by, say, a Japanese car company, but operating in the U.S.?
Those are included in U.S. GDP. The focus is on where production happens, not the company's nationality. And of course, we're measuring this production over a specific time frame, usually a year or a quarter, to track changes in economic activity.
So GDP is like a snapshot of a nation's economic output over a specific period. But like any snapshot, it's got its limitations. However, it doesn't capture things like unpaid work or environmental damage.
You're right. GDP doesn't account for things like household chores, volunteer work, or the depletion of natural resources. Valuable tool, but not a perfect measure of emissions well, for sure.
Okay, so we need to be mindful of what GDP captures and what it misses. Now, is there more than one way to slice this GDP pie? Can we look at it from different angles?
Absolutely. We can view GDP through three different lenses, really: production, expenditure, and income. The production approach, which we discussed, focuses on what's actually needed in the economy.
Okay, got it. What about the expenditure approach then?
This perspective looks at who's buying all that output. We divide spending into four main categories: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports.
So it's about tracking where all the money is going in the economy. Consumption would be things like groceries, clothes, entertainment, basically what households spend, right?
Exactly. Then we have investment, which isn't about buying stocks and bonds, In economics, investment means spending on things that actually increase the economy's productive capacity. Think machines, factories, new construction.
Ah, okay. So spending aimed at creating more goods and services in the future. What about the government's role in all this?
Government purchases include everything from teacher salaries and road construction to defense spending. It's a big chunk of overall expenditure.
And finally, net exports. That's where international trade comes in. We subtract imports from exports to get that net impact of trade on GDP, right?
Precisely. And this brings us to a crucial identity in macroeconomics. GDP equals production equals expenditure equals income.
Whoa, that's a lot of equal signs. Hold on. Why is income included in this equation?
Because every time a good or service is sold, the money earned from that sale, it ultimately ends up as someone's income. It might be wages for workers, profits for businesses, or interest for lenders.
Oh, I see. So the money earned from production gets spent, and that spending fuels more production. So it's a circular flow.
You got it. That's why economists can use these three approaches interchangeably. They're just different ways of measuring the same thing, the overall level of economic activity.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this GDP concept.
Yeah.
But what about this real versus nominal GDP? I hear those terms thrown around, but
That's a great question, and it brings us to the issue of inflation. Nominal GDP measures output using current prices, but those prices can be distorted by inflation.
so if prices go up, the amount of stuff we're actually producing stays the same. Nominal GDP would increase even though the economy isn't really growing.
Exactly. That's why we need real GDP. It adjusts for inflation, uses prices from a base year. Figure 38, it uses a simplified example to show how real GDP isolates those changes in output from changes in prices.
So it's like removing that magnifying glass of inflation to see the true size of the economy. Real GDP gives us a clearer picture of how much we're actually producing.
Precisely, and that's why economists really focus on real GDP when they're analyzing economic growth trends.
Makes sense. Now, how do we actually measure this inflation? We use the term a lot, but how do we quantify it?
That's where the Consumer Price Index comes in, the CPI. It's a widely used measure of inflation that basically tracks the price changes of a representative basket of goods and services.
So it's like following the price of, like a typical shopping cart, right? Filled with things people use. Figure 39 shows an example of how this basket is weighted. It seems like if the price of something people buy a lot of, like those t-shirts in the example, goes up, it has a bigger impact on the overall CPI.
Exactly. The quantities of items in that basket, they matter because they reflect consumer spending patterns. The CPI helps us track how the cost of living changes over time, but it's not just a theoretical number.
Right, like adjusting Social Security benefits or factoring cost of living increases into wages. Understanding the CPI helps us navigate the impact of inflation on our everyday lives.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that even the CPI has its imperfections. It might actually overstate the true increase in the cost of living.
Really? Why is that? I always thought the CPI was pretty straightforward. Just measure the prices of a bunch of stuff and there you go.
Well, there's this thing called substitution bias. As prices change, people tend to, switch to cheaper alternatives. Like if prices go up, they might buy more chicken. But the CPI assumes a fixed basket of goods, so it doesn't capture this consumer behavior.
So the CPI might not reflect how people adapt to price changes by changing their spending habits.
Right.
What are some other reasons for this potential overstatement?
Another factor is unmeasured quality change. Products, they get better over time. Think about computers and smartphones. They're way more powerful and feature-rich than they used to be. But the CPI might not fully account for this added value when it's measuring those price increases.
So a price increase might be partly due to better quality, not just inflation. Okay, that makes sense. What's the third issue?
The introduction of new goods and services. When a groundbreaking product first appears, it's not immediately included in the CPI basket, right? So if that product gets popular and its price drops, those initial price decreases aren't being captured.
So the CPI might miss the inflationary effect of new technologies and products. Man, this is making me realize that measuring inflation is way more complex than I thought.
You're right, it's not as simple as it seems. The Boston Commission, which studied these issues, estimated that the CPI might actually overstate inflation by about 1.3% per year because of these factors.
Wow. Okay, so CPI is a useful tool, but not without its flaws. Are there any other ways to measure inflation?
Yes, there's the GDP deflator, which is derived from the relationship between real and nominal GDP. Figure 40 shows how the CPI and the GDP deflator compare. They generally move together, but there are some differences.
Right, the GDP deflator looks a bit smoother, less volatile than the CPI. Is that because of those weighting differences you mentioned earlier?
Exactly. The GDP deflator only includes domestically produced goods, while the CPI includes imports. And the GDP deflator uses current production levels as weights, reflecting changes in consumption patterns, while the CPI uses that fixed basket.
So depending on what's happening with import prices and consumer spending, the two measures can diverge a bit. It's fascinating stuff.
It is. We've covered a lot of ground on GDP and inflation, but we can't wrap up this macroeconomic tour without going deeper into unemployment.
Right, we briefly touched on it earlier, but it's time to go beyond that headline unemployment rate. What's really going on behind that number?
It's not just a simple count of people out of work. Economists distinguish between different types of unemployment, each with its own causes and implications.
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. Break it down for me. What are these different types?
Well, the first type is called frictional unemployment. It's like the natural churn of the labor market, People entering the workforce for the first time, switching jobs, moving between cities. Even in a booming economy, you'll have some frictional unemployment.
So even if there are enough jobs, it takes time for people to find the right one, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Then there's structural unemployment. This happens when there's a mismatch between the skills workers have and the skills employers need. Technological advances can cause this. Think about jobs lost to automation.
Right, like when robots start replacing factory workers.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the number of jobs, but also whether people are prepared for the kinds of jobs out there.
Exactly. And globalization can play a role too, as companies move production to countries with lower labor costs. The jobs might exist, but maybe not in the same place anymore.
Globalization, that's a whole other deep dive for sure. But this is giving me a better picture of how it all ties into unemployment. Okay, what's the third type?
The third type is cyclical unemployment, and this is the one that policymakers really worry about. It's directly tied to those ups and downs of the business cycle we were talking about earlier. During recessions, demand for goods and services falls, businesses cut back, and, people lose their jobs.
So cyclical unemployment, that's the kind of spikes during those economic downturns, right? It's driven by that overall weakness in the economy.
Precisely. And understanding these different types of unemployment is really important because they require different policy responses.
Okay, so breaking unemployment down into these categories gives us a much clearer picture of what's going on. We've covered a lot of ground on these core concepts, GDP, inflation, unemployment, but it's interesting to see how intertwined they all are. They're all pieces of that same economic puzzle.
Absolutely. And speaking of puzzles, let's tackle one of the big ones in macroeconomics. How do we achieve long-term economic growth? We all want to see our economies grow, right? More output, more jobs, rising living standards, all that.
Sounds good to me. But how do we actually make that happen? What drives this sustained economic growth?
Economists point to a few factors, and one of the most important is technological progress. New inventions, innovations, they lead to greater efficiency, new products, whole new industries even. Think about the steam engine, electricity, the internet. Each of these technological leaps has basically reshaped our economy and really boosted productivity.
Right, and greater productivity means we can produce more output with the same amount of resources, which is key harder, it's about working smarter.
Exactly. But technology on its own, it isn't enough. We also need to invest in human capital. That means education, training, healthcare, things that enhance the skills and knowledge of the workforce.
So it's about having people who can not only use that technology, but invent new technologies, adapt to those changing demands, and constantly push the boundaries.
Precisely. A skilled, educated workforce, it's key for innovation, adaptability, and ultimately long-term economic growth.
It's interesting how we often frame education as this like individual benefit, but it has these huge macroeconomic implications too. What other factors contribute to long-term growth?
Another crucial one is physical capital accumulation, which is a fancy way of saying we need to invest in things like infrastructure, roads, bridges, communication networks. We also need to invest in factories, machinery, equipment that increase our productive capacity.
So it's like giving the economy better tools to work with.
That's a great way to put it. And we can't forget about the importance of a stable and predictable institutional environment.
Okay, now what does that mean? Are we getting into the political realm here?
Not necessarily. It's more about having the right, rules of the game, rules that support economic activity. Things like a well-functioning legal system, strong property rights, low corruption, sound macroeconomic policies. These all create a climate of confidence that encourages investment and entrepreneurship.
So it's about having a level playing field where businesses can, thrive, innovate, take risks without that fear of arbitrary interference or instability.
Exactly. Long-term growth is complex. It depends on all these factors working together.
This has given me a much deeper understanding of what complexities of economic growth. It's not just about hoping it happens. It requires these intentional policies and investments. Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about something a bit more concrete. Money. We all use it every day. But what actually is money, and why do we even need it?
Great question. At its core, money is anything that is widely accepted as a medium of exchange. It's what allows us to buy and sell goods and services without resorting to bartering,
Can you imagine trying to barter for everything? I'd probably end up with a barn full of livestock and no way to pay my rent.
Right. Money solves that problem. It acts as this common denominator, a standard of value that lets us easily compare the worth of different things and make those transactions smoothly.
So money, it greases the wheels of the economy. It facilitates trade and makes specialization possible, which is kind of essential for a complex modern economy, right?
Absolutely. But money has other important roles too. It's a unit of account, a way to measure and report economic value. Think about how we use money to keep track of our income, our expenses, our assets.
Right, everything has a price tag, which makes it a lot easier to make those decisions and plan for the future.
And money also acts as a store of value. It allows us to save that purchasing power for the future.
So I don't have to spend all my earnings today. I can save some for later use. Makes sense. But what gives money value? I know in the past it was linked to gold or silver, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
You're right. Today, most currencies are what we call fiat money.
Fiat money, what does that mean?
It means that the government declares it to be legal tender. Basically, giving it value by decree. It's not backed by a physical commodity like gold anymore.
So our dollars have value because the government says they do, and we all agree to accept them as payment. It's kind of this collective trust in the system, isn't it?
Exactly. A bit of a leap of faith, but it works because we have faith in the institutions that back our currency. Speaking of those institutions, the government plays a big role in defining money, but how does it actually control the amount of money in circulation? That's where central banks come in. In the U.S., we have the Federal Reserve, often called the Fed.
The Fed. The Fed. We hear about them all the time, but I'll admit, I'm not always sure what they do.
One of the Fed's main jobs is to manage the money supply, which refers to the total amount of money available in the economy at any given time.
Okay, money supply. That sounds important.
It is. The Fed has a few tools to control the money supply. One is open market operations, which involves buying or selling government bonds.
Okay, walk me through that. How does buying or selling bonds affect how much money is out there?
When the Fed buys bonds, it injects money into the economy. When it sells bonds, it withdraws money.
So it's like adjusting the water level in a pool.
That's a good analogy. Another tool the Fed uses is the discount rate. That's the interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow money from the Fed.
So by raising or lowering that discount rate, the Fed can influence how much banks are willing to lend, which then ripples out and affects the overall money supply.
Exactly. And in recent years, the Fed has also used quantitative easing, which is liquidity into the financial system, hoping to lower long-term interest rates and encourage lending and investment.
Quantitative easing. I've heard that term a lot, but this is making it a bit clearer. Okay, so the Fed has these levers it can pull to adjust the money supply. Why is that so important? What happens if there's too much or too little money circulating?
That's where the connection between money and inflation becomes crucial. When there's too much money chasing too few goods and services, prices tend to rise. It's like an auction where everyone suddenly has more money to bid. Those prices will get driven up.
Right, like when there's limited supply of something everyone wants, price goes up.
Exactly. And when prices rise across the board, we get inflation. So controlling the money supply is key to keeping inflation in check. On the other hand, if there's not enough money circulating, it can stifle economic activity.
How so?
Well, if people and businesses are worried about a lack of liquidity, they might hold back on spending and investment. It's like the economy gets a little, constipated.
So it's a delicate balancing act. The Fed needs to find that sweet spot. Enough money to keep the economy moving, but not so much that it triggers runaway inflation.
You got it. That's why central banking is often described as the art of the possible.